So David, maybe you could start by telling us what was it about Pelagius, that you found so fascinating, that drew you to him?
Okay, thank you very much for those very kind words, Victor. Limpid prose, it's wonderful. And thank everybody for turning up, thank you. Look, when you start writing something, you don't usually, well, I speak for myself, I don't have a specific thing in mind. There was lots of reasons. You know, Pelagius I'd heard of, and he was obscure, and he had been, his history was sort of like written by the winners, by the church leaders, and therefore it was topsy-turvy, and he deserved to be rescued from that. I was also, like we all are, fascinated and horrified at the same time by the depth to which the Catholic Church is currently wallowing over its sexual sort of crimes and cover-ups, and wondered whether there was any sort of stuff in the past that sort of shed any light on that really awful culture that prevails within the Vatican. And when I started writing, I found that in any case, Arwell, who was the first person narrator, more or less took over the story, and I tried very hard to hold him back from being too modern and sort of having a modern view of these arguments. But I think he got away from me sometimes. But mainly, I was just fascinated by what would happen to a Welsh boy kidnapped at the age of 12, thrown into the company of Catholics and churchmen, and observing the struggles that then happened for the next 40 years, which included the first sack of Rome by Alaric, and included the virtual breakdown, well, the split between the Eastern and Western empires, and all sorts of terrible things. The very first execution of a Christian by other Christians. I mean, it was very common for Christians to be, or people to be executed for being Christians, but in the latter half of the 4th century, we got the beginning of people being executed for being the wrong sort of Christians. And so that really struck me. I sort of found that anecdote in some old history books, and then sort of went looking for more sources, and sort of ended. I mean, it's just taken me years, you know. You keep reading more and more ancient history, and you tend then to sort of start living in the 4th century rather than the 1st. Anyway, the ideas that you mentioned, yes, they are also fascinating, because with Pelagius and Augustine, you see very vaguely and you know, dimly, the very first time that problem presents itself of nature and nurture, of whether people are inherently perfectible or inherently corrupt, and nothing will ever make them any better. And that's the sort of axis on which a lot of our history has subsequently developed. You know, whether you are left or right wing, very often sort of comes back to how you view human nature, whether people can be trusted or not. And Pelagius believed that they could be, and Augustine believed very firmly that they couldn't. And so you see that as the very first instance in history of that particular paradigm.
So that was his main antagonist, Augustine, who's called the Bishop of Hippo, or they call him the African bishop very early on. He's just referred to as that African bishop. And he's the main antagonist for Pelagius' position. And that struggle between those two ideas, like free will and original sin, got seeded very early on because Augustine won the battle. And out of that comes, as David said, a whole evolution of history that didn't just affect the church, that's affected our culture in ways that we really need to... You know, when you rip up a weed in the garden, you find that it sort of goes off in all directions. And it's surprising when you go back to the root where this comes from. So do you want to restate that the crux of their battle, of their argument?
Okay. Basically, Augustine. Well, if you make a sort of parody of their positions, it becomes clearer. Pelagius, his critics would say, as a parody of him, that he didn't need God, because he basically believed that once human beings were told what was right and what was wrong in the Bible or by Jesus, then using their own willpower, they should follow that path. And you get a very humanistic type of Christianity out of that view. And it's not really his view, it's a parody of it, but that's the extreme. And Augustine, on the other hand, believed that you could do nothing without the aid of God, and so he developed this very complicated and very deep philosophy of the grace of God. And unfortunately, towards the end of his life, he sort of made it so extreme that it actually becomes a sort of predestination, that you can't do anything unless God reaches down and helps you. Well, that's good, but it actually means that most people will give up. Most people will just lie in the ditch, because whether they're helped or not by God is out of their control anyway. And so you get this very passive sort of attitude. And of course, politically, this was wonderful. You had the civic power breaking down everywhere. You had what the old Roman empire's bureaucracy and ways of ruling people, and then you had the shadow of that being developed, which was the Catholic Church. And it was very desirable by the people who ruled the church, and indeed by the civil rulers, that you should have a philosophy that made people passive, that made people dependent and obedient. And so Augustine fulfilled that role perfectly.
And authority figures, like at one stage, Arwell writes a sort of prologue to one chapter, and he talks about our present Pope, the Pope of that time, the bloodthirsty Celestine, is particularly keen on preventing the proliferation of incorrect thoughts. There's a really strong flavour of a totalitarian regime being sort of run by the church, you know, and the church could roll the civic authorities, you know. I mean, even supposedly the crucifixion of Jesus, you know, it was really engineered by the rabbis or the Sanhedrin, you know, and the Roman authorities allowed it to happen, and Pilate famously washed his hands of it. So there was an extraordinary amount of power actually centred in the church, and it's taken so long for a more humanistic attitude towards human perfection and human decision-making and human sovereignty to emerge from under the thrall of this tightly controlling church, you know, which has always sought political power. You can't separate religion and politics. So wouldn't you say that Pelagius, in a way, was a precursor of humanism?
Well, he has been taken that way, certainly. And because we know so little of him, it's hard to say. I suspect that he and Augustine would have had far more in common than they had that wasn't in common. They would have both believed that the Old Testament was a history, a historical record. The difference between them is theological rather than in practice, I suspect. What Pelagius was saying was that he was just basically speaking of the Christian religion as it had always been practiced. And in his view, it was Augustine and the African bishops that were bringing in this new fangled sort of ideas. And he wasn't the one who was the heretic, it was them. But they had the they had the divisions they had the legions on their side, they had the emperor on their side, and I'm not going to give away the ending, so I won't say what I was going to say, but basically, it's all history anyway. Pelagius was defeated by politics, not by ideas, not by losing the argument, but by losing physical sort of manoeuvring behind the scenes.
And Augustine was a bishop, whereas Pelagius was really a sort of just a pious man, wasn't he?
Yes.
Was he even a monk?
No,
but he lived a very abstemious life.
Oh yeah.
And felt that he was living according to the true Christian model.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about the 3rd or 4th century. So, it had there was a tradition there. So Augustine, the bishop, managed to maneuver and manipulate political power to win the ideas battle. So I'm interested in I saw it a couple of years ago, I don't know how long ago it was, maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago. I saw a movie about an Alexandrian figure, a woman called Hypatia, who was a teacher of mathematics and geometry and astronomy, and she was an outstanding woman of her time, and yet she was assassinated. In this film, she's assassinated by a bunch of overzealous Christians who murder her. And I'm interested that you're actually attracted to her as a figure. Is there any historical record that they would have met?
No. But it's perfectly reasonable that they would have been in the same place at the same time. And so I do have them meeting in Alexandria a year before Hypatia is murdered, and then the story of her murder is also, of course, related in the book. Hypatia is a wonderful, wonderful character, and I actually dedicate the book to her. And I had this wonderful experience this morning. I met Bob Brown and gave him a copy of my book, and he gave me a copy of his book called Earth. And I looked at it, and it said, dedicated to Hypatia. Snap. So we both had the same very high opinion of this woman. And he said, that basically she was murdered at the beginning of the 5th century, and mathematics did not advance for the next 500 years. And we can put that down to extremism, to Christian extremism, because she was murdered by a bunch of monks.
Monks?
Yeah, monks from the desert that came into Alexandria at the beck and call of a bishop called Cyril, who was having a struggle with the prefect of Alexandria called Orestes. Funnily enough, this is all in that film called Agora, which came out about a year ago, 2 years ago. And the film, though crude and it telescopes time and introduces a lot of nonsense about her, is nevertheless historically quite good, when you think of the way films normally destroy history. It's quite accurate.
It's quite savage. So maybe has her story been told a lot? I mean, maybe it's time to recuperate the story of Hypatia too.
She was, she was, like the church was very guilty, felt very guilty about her for a very long time, and so she didn't tend to come up when the church was ruling European civilization for 1,000 years. You would not find the name of Hypatia very much. But in the 19th century, a couple of novelists began to examine her life. There was a couple of novels about her life in the 19th century. And since then, there's been quite a few sort of studies. and people certainly recognise her importance intellectually.
So, I mean, it seems to me she was a very rational person and a humanist, not operating according to, I mean, she was obviously a product of her times too, but she represents the sort of the freedom of intellectual pursuit, you know, of intellectual inquiry, and yet can be so easily suppressed and literally murdered by zealots, you know, who want to extirpate all other points of view. Do you think as a writer and in your personal life, that the intellectual life is necessarily antipathetic to the spiritual life?
Gosh.
I already know the answer you should give, knowing you. I've known this man for 39 years.
Yeah. No, look, I don't think they're incompatible, but you can't put any form of spiritual inquiry into an institution or into any sort of power structure. It just destroys it.
Yeah. And that's why, you know, the church is very anti-mysticism, because if a mystic has a direct experience of the indwelling, deathless state, whatever you want to call it, don't want to get into theological discussions, but that takes away all the church's power, because they're no longer the intermediary, you know. So they had to grab that power very, very early on. And I noticed that our current Pope, Pope Benedict XVI, used to be the head. His main qualification, apart from being a theologian in Germany and running, you know, religious studies departments in famous universities, in the Vatican, he was the head of the, what's it called? It's called the, I forgot the name. The convocation for the, more unpack. For the
It's the old Inquisition with a new name.
Yeah, it's the old Inquisition. It's the Office of the Inquisition, rebranded. And he was personally responsible for actually banning the books written by, you know, Jesuit scholars and other Christian scholars in the 20th century in Europe. His job was to actually stamp out their work. And they would be, you know, dismissed from their order and excommunicated from the church if they continued to write or publish those books. That was his main job in the Vatican before he became the Pope.
It just seems that the Catholic Church, from its inception, has been misogynist. And of course the Hexenhammer, which was the beginning of the Inquisition, was from a German monk. So anything to say about the very nature of misogyny of the Catholic Church?
It has been misogynist for the vast length of its history, but in fact, curiously, it wasn't at the very beginning. In the very beginning, women had an equal part in the church authority. It was Paul's influence. Paul hated women, and gradually his view of Jesus prevailed, and even as late as the period that I'm writing about, this was still some sort of controversy. That I mean, the character Priscillian, who was executed, one of the things that he was executed for was for allowing women to take a lead in the congregation. You know, that was one of his terrible crimes. So it was still possible for people to think that way, even in the 4th century. But you're right, I mean, misogyny is sort of almost, it's the dye in the weave and weft of the Catholic Church, so there's no getting it out. It's just there.
And Paul's point of view just took over and became the orthodoxy, and history's written by the winners, sort of thing, you know. So I think, another one, yes?
I often think that Augustine didn't actually develop a philosophy as such, but simply saw his ideas, where he got them from, God knows, as the most effective way of controlling people. I mean, if people are on the back foot right from, you know, when they're born, I mean, the arguments against the concept of original sin are just, you know, they're common sense. And you know, I doubt whether he was a philosopher in this respect. I think somebody said, hey, here's a good way of keeping them in line, and it was adopted simply for that purpose, and it's gone on throughout. I mean, ask any Catholic about, you know, the concept of guilt, which remains with them for all of their lives, unless they manage to shake it off somehow.
Well, Augustine definitely introduced guilt as a major factor in the religion. But I think that all those things came together. I mean, I don't think he deliberately set out to create a civility for people to, you know, to become or a thing to control people. I think that happened. It was part of his character, part of his nature to act like that. He when he was young, he was totally. First of all, he became a Manichaean. He believed that there was a battle in heaven between good and evil, and that in fact the world was created by a demiurge, not by God, but by a sort of inferior being, and it was totally corrupt, and that your whole body, you know, you had to despise because the reality was somewhere else, and those beliefs were very deeply imbued in him. And when he left that, became a Christian, he, I think, brought that feeling, that darkness, into his interpretation of the fall of Adam. He didn't see it as a parable of disobedience. He saw it as concupiscence that destroyed the very nature of creation. Adam's act completely corrupted creation. It wasn't just, you know, a one-off that he did, or even a one-off that he did that affected the human race. It affected everything. You know, the entire universe was corrupted by Adam's one act. And this is the sort of mythologizing of a rather sick mind, as far as I can understand, or as far as a modern person can understand. You have to try and understand it from its context, its historical context. But even if you do, I still think you have to say, whoa, this is weird stuff. And the people at the time did say that. They did say, whoa, this is weird stuff. But they lost. Yeah, the sensible people lost. And so that's how we've got the church that we have today.